So thank you very much for inviting me here, David, Todd, Nancy. I've really enjoyed my day visiting with a number of you and classroom earlier today here at the University of Richmond. I'm enjoying my life in Northern Virginia. I know that's another world up there, which is where I'm living temporarily as a program officer at the National Science Foundation. But my academic life is at Michigan State University in the Department of Geography. And I have worked in the Amazon for a long time, a couple decades now. And so I'm going to share with you today a piece of research that I'm working on. It has some specific empirical work that I'm doing, but really what I'm presenting to you today is more of a thought piece. Hopefully we'll have time at the end for some questions from you all about this topic. So Amazonian dark Earth's implications for the region. I'm going to start by giving you a little background on, well, what are these dark Earths? Are they rare Earths or are they something else? And I'll share with you that they're actually a type of soil. And then after I've explained to you what they are, I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of them. And I know that some of you, through some of your coursework with Dr. Salisbury, may already be familiar with them. But a lot of people are really not familiar with Amazonian dark Earths. So hopefully there'll be something new for everyone here today. So what are Amazonian dark Earths? Well, Amazonian dark Earths are a continuum of anthropogenic or anthropic soils. And that means that they have something to do with people. Anthropogenic means that they were generated by people. Anthropic means they were the result of people in habitation. But bottom line is that these dark Earths are in some form or another related to people's occupation of space in the Amazon region in the past. So scientists have documented Amazonian dark Earths for quite a few decades, mostly in historical work. But it's really not until probably 15 years ago or so that there was really scientific attention to these soils as something quite revolutionary because they are so odd. If you remember from Ecology 101, right, in lowland tropical rainforests, you typically find soils that are not very nutrient rich. You find ones that are weathered, that are leached. And so here's these soils that are dark. That's why they're called Amazonian dark Earths. They are, in fact, some of them are black, very, very dark, and others are brown. So they're part of a continuum because what we've discovered is that there are what are called the true dark Earth, the terra preta do índio, meaning black earth of the Indians, which are very dark, black earths. They are certainly the result of long-term habitation and of middens, so of garbage dumps, essentially compost piles from the Indians in the past. These soils have ceramics in them. They are classified by soil scientists as cultic archaeoanthrosols, anthrosols being these anthropogenic soils. And likely these soils are simply the result of people having lived in places over time. On the other end of the continuum are these terra mulatas, brown earths, which are likely the result of semi-intensive agriculture, a kind of agriculture sometimes referred to as slash and char, which is a little bit different from slash and burn that you might have heard about in the Amazon, where people cut down vegetation and burn it to ash, and then let that ash incorporate into the soil and use it as a fertilizer. Slash and char is a cooler, slower burn that burns the organic material into a kind of charcoal that retains nutrients. So that's a very key piece of this puzzle. These brown earths don't have ceramics typically, are classified a little bit differently, and we think have some level of intentionality. That means that Indians in the past, and possibly people today still, are creating this slash and char, doing the slash and char, creating a material that they're incorporating into the soil. So some of the properties of these dark earth soils, and this is an extreme here, and again, if you remember Ecology 101, oxasols here, the orange soils are the highly weathered leach soils, more typically associated with lowland tropical rainforests. On the other side are the ADEs, these darker soils that are these dark earths made by the Indians. So as you can see, a great contrast in color, but not only that contrast in color is a contrast in fertility. So there's very high fertility of these soils because of the high levels of organic matter, of carbon, of calcium, phosphorus, and cation exchange capacity, which is the CEC there, which is a measure that soil scientists use to measure the amount of available nutrients there are in the soil. So these darker soils have really good plant available nutrients in them. They also appear to retain moisture over time, which you may wonder, well, aren't these found in the Amazon, tropical lowland? Why would moisture be an issue? Well, actually parts of the Brazilian Amazon have a very distinct dry season. And so moisture retention for some farmers is actually of importance. So charcoal appears to be the key, and soil chemists and agronomists have done research on these soils that have demonstrated the slash and char process, where people are slowly smoldering in a slow, cool burn organic debris that is then produces a charcoal that is called an aromatic charcoal and has particular nutrient attracting sites on it. And we're getting into a little bit of soil chemistry here, but it has that attraction, which is why it is so good for plant and crop growth. We also know that there is a microbial complex that is somewhat unique and is still very understudied in these Amazonian dark earths. And people are working on it, but there's still a lot less known about them. So again, their formation, we know there's human origin. We know that in part because of their chemical signatures, the phosphorus in particular, and that they're ceramics in those really dark earths that are found there. And that's definitely indicative of these soils from the past. Some of the dating they've done on the deposits that they found in the Amazon date the soils 2,500 years ago, and some older than that. So we know these have this human signature. As I mentioned, the slash and char appears to be the critical component to how these were made. And what this demonstrates is evidence of long-term occupancy and settlement and use of agriculture in a more permanent way than we typically associate with the Amazon. So this is part of the implications for the region, is the fact that these soils really are reflecting a different kind of life way that existed in the Amazon than is often acknowledged to have existed there. One of the questions we grapple with, those of us working on this topic, is how purposeful the activities were. And again, I've already mentioned the theories that the terra mulata was likely more intentional than the black earth soils. But that's a hypothesis, and we're not really certain. And one of the pieces of research that I've been involved with recently is what I call sweep and char. I've done quite a bit of research on home gardens in the Amazon, so people's spaces around their house and the importance of the plants in them for livelihoods and gift exchange networks. And as part of that research, I noticed that women were managing their gardens in such a way that they were creating something locally called terra queimada, or burnt earth. And having a background in an interest in local knowledge, local soil knowledge, and in soil science, I decided to pursue this a little bit further, and I have an ongoing project with some agronomists in Brazil, where we're trying to understand this process, where on everyday practice, women sweep organic debris. And this is a tropical rainforest environment, and the trees in home gardens are almost all domesticates of some sort, but they litter leaves every day, and these things are swept to a certain part of the yard, and there, over time, this material is smoldered. And if any of you have ever traveled in developing countries, you know, especially in rural areas, that people are burning all the time, getting rid of debris. What is interesting here is that they're getting rid of organic debris, but then they're using that as a soil conditioner on some of the new plants that they have that they've planted in their home garden. And so what we conjecture is that this terra queimada, as it is locally known, may well be a system that was used by Indians in the past to create these black earths that we see in the landscape today. Because the mestizo people with whom I did this work have knowledge systems that do tie back to Indians. And some research by anthropologists have shown research with the Kayapo and the Kikuru Indians that there's some of these same systems still in place in agricultural systems of those Amerindians. One of the challenges of this research is that in Amazonia, because of high, very, very high depopulation at and after colonialism, there was a real cultural disconnect between the Indian groups there today and those that existed before the Portuguese and other Europeans arrived. So tracing knowledge systems into the past is very hard because people's lifeways really changed a lot when, due to depopulation, about 90% of the Indians died as a consequence of diseases and slavery and other consequences of colonialism. So that's one of the challenges, which is why today we're trying to work with mestizo groups as well as some Indian groups to try to understand these processes. So where are these located? Where have they been found? Well, they're mostly in small patches on bluff locations around the Amazon. And relatively small patches, as you can see, 200 to 300 plus hectares, which is really small when you think about the scale of the Amazon basin. The Amazon basin is as big as the lower 48 states. So, you know, these are little tiny patches of soil that are the result of past inhabitation. But when people produce soil maps of the region, these things don't make it onto the map, as it were. They are inclusions in broader categories of soils. One thing that often comes up when I talk, which is why I added the second bullet point here, is people ask, well, aren't there organic rich soils in the Amazon, histosols, which are swamp soils? And yes, there are. In floodplain areas, there certainly are histosols. But their chemical constituencies are very different. When histosols are no longer wet, they lose a lot of their organic matter, which dissipates and weathers out very quickly. So we know for sure these are not histosols. So one of the things I've done, one of the papers that I've published on dark earth soils is one that I did with a graduate student, the then graduate student at Michigan State University, Steve Aldrich. And we created an interactive GIS of all known locations of Amazonian dark earth. So this is a screenshot of this interactive GIS, and if you want a link to it, I'm happy to provide you with that. We wrote a publication explaining how we created this, which is cited there. But it's been very hard to collect all those points together. So we created this interactive GIS where each noted location in a publication, which could be an academic location or it might be historical accounts, is in this Google Earth overlay. And you can zero in on particular dots. This is just the screenshot of the whole thing. But you can see, I think in this visual, you can see that there is a little bit of a pattern. Mostly the locations are along bluffs. Now, does that mean that we know that that's the only place where dark earths are? Well, no. It's just that that's where people have documented them. There's still a lot of the Amazon where people have not documented them. They haven't gone looking. There is no full soil survey of the Amazon. So we suspect there's a whole lot more of them out there, but we don't know where they are. But the ones that we do know about, what you can do is drill down to one of those dots, and then a little thing will pop up and will tell you something about that one. So here's an example of a location on Ilha de Marajó, which is a big island in the mouth of the Amazon. And this is an example of a location with low confidence. So what we did with each of these locations, we plotted them, and then we inserted bibliographic information and a confidence level, because some of these sources are historical sources. So this is a historical source. This is low confidence because we're not really sure that it's there. This is a historical source from 1879, and it says, "We found the black land and its antiquities," meaning the ceramics, "of the bluffs of the Panema and the Diamantina." So it says on the bluffs of these two little streams. Well, there's actually a lot of streams called that. We know from the historical source they were talking about Marajo, and Steve and I did our best to locate it there, but we're not exactly sure that it's exactly there. We also are not sure whether it was a true, probably it was a true terra preta because it refers to the antiquities, but we don't know because we don't have any soil information about it. Then another example is this one here, where if you click on this little point, this is an example of a high confidence location, and this is a place near the city of Santarém where actual soil research was done. So a pit was dug and the layers analyzed, and so this is a site with high confidence. So we know of its location better, and we know that it really was a terra preta. So this is an interactive source that we created, and we hope to keep updated. So we do have a sense of where they are, at least the ones we have located thus far. And as I pointed out, going back to this map, you can see that there is a bit of a pattern that they are along the bluffs. And now why are they located along bluffs or along what looks to you perhaps along river valleys? And that's because, first of all, Indians were living on the bluffs. We know that from a lot of other research. We also know that most people traveling in the Amazon travel by river, and therefore historians and naturalists who came to the Amazon were the first documenters of these soils traveled that way. And since then, it's still the predominant way of travel around the basin, despite a few roads here and there. So, now you know a bit about what these dark earth soils, these anthrosols in the Amazon. So now, how about the implications of the existence of those soils? And there are two parts to this. One is that I want to talk a little bit about revisions of the past views of the region, and then project into the future and conjecture as to whether it changes anything about the future of that place. So what Amazonian dark earths have really done is bringing greater history and humanizing the Amazon, which has often been a place thought to be of wild virgin forest with very low impact by people in the past. And so what we know of prehistory in the Amazon is one thing, and what is popularized in the popular media is one thing, but we're starting to learn much more about a more complicated history, and one that is continuing to emerge as new research is done. So, but to focus on that prehistory for a moment, I want to just challenge you, because we all walk into this room with views of the Amazon region. And I think that there are often these dichotomies of the Amazon region that almost all of us have both in our heads, although maybe we only have one side of it in our heads. But out there in the world, there are often these dichotomies. If you ask different people, you have these different things. So for a moment, think about your own. You saw the flyer, or you were told to come to this lecture for extra credit, or because you had to for your class. And you hear the word Amazon, and what comes into your mind as Amazon? And does it line up with any of these? So almost always there's some sort of pristine forest or environmental destruction or conservation, right? If you're interested in conservation issues, Amazon is sort of a poster child of a lot of issues. But then there are others who want to develop the region. Boom and bust. If you know some of the history of commodities in the Amazon, you know there was a rubber boom, there was a jute boom, there were other booms of other particular materials. But those have all gone bust, except for soybeans, which hasn't gone bust yet, but that's another story. Lungs of the world, right? The Amazon's the lungs of the world. But the Brazilians right now see it as a breadbasket of the world with the soybeans. So, two different views. Then there are the historical ecologists, those who want to see a more human history of the natural environment in the Amazon, and conservation biologists, some of whom still would prefer not to have any people around, because we want to really look at only animals and plants there and let those be and conserve those. So just a couple images to go with that. This image of pristine nature, primeval nature, right? The Amazon, we often think of back of this nature and people being very small in them. So pictures like this, the trees really big, people very small, little boats, people living in harmony with nature if they are there at all. But then we might also have this, right? It's the destruction of the rainforest. So here, the human imprint is really large on top of that natural image. And wherever humans go, they're destroying this nature. The reality is that it's probably somewhere in between, where a lot of the Amazon is one of a cultural forest, where there's a lot of forest. Thankfully, there is still a lot of forest there. But a lot of the forest is an imprint of people in the botany of the forest, in the ecology of the forest. And that is only slowly emerging as ethnobotanists and as others and as ecologists are looking at concentrations of certain species. They're realizing that some of those are legacies of prior inhabitation. So if you look at a picture like this, that to the Western eye may look like, wow, isn't that jungle? But when you ask local people, every one of those species has some utility. They may be domesticates, they may be semi-domesticated plants. Some of them are wild things, but they're gathered or they're used in some way. So there's this cultural element to the forest. Why? Because a lot of this was either planted by people who live there or incidentally not removed. So if plants emerge and are volunteers, they are left because they're identified as a useful plant. So people and nature in Amazonia are actually very deeply entwined. However, the majority opinion still holds that the natural forces and processes, little impacted by human action until recently, are responsible for the current vegetation composition of the region. This by an archaeologist who's done a lot of work on with the Kikuyu Indians and really has brought to fore a lot about the revision of the Amazon. But the image that much of the popular press still portrays is of this wild nature, where people were not the way that the forest was structured. Bringing it back to the lack of people, a lot of textbooks have maps in it like this, where you have something about Latin America. I think this is straight out of a geography textbook, where there's always acknowledgement of the high civilizations of the Andes and in Mesoamerica, places where clearly humans had a huge imprint, right? The terraces of the Andes, the incredible temples in Mesoamerica. But the Amazon is always this blank, this nada over there, because people were thought to either be part of nature or just hardly there. So we don't think about it very much. But what about those Amazonian dark earths? If these are located throughout the basin and they're evidence of people having lived there in the past, then how come this is such a blank slate? People have been there for millennia. It's never been a very densely populated place. The Amazon basin certainly was not an Indus Valley, it was not a Nile Valley, but it had people for a long time. And people continue to be there. And yes, they left an imprint. They did not build temples, stone temples. They did not frankly, there's no stone in the Amazon, so it's very difficult to build such structures. But what they did do is leave an imprint on the botany of the forest and on the soils of the forest, because they moved species, they concentrated species, they grew cultural forests, they selectively selected plants that they wanted around their habitation. And they also in their settlements, and we know this now from recent archaeological work, they were much more sedentary, right? This image that we have in the past of them nomadic and slash and burn agriculturalists and moving all the time is not quite right at all. In fact, many people think that slash and burn agriculture is an adaptation to post-colonial times in Amazonia. So that in the past there was sedentary agriculture in large villages. Okay, yes, these are not cities. It's not Tenochtitlan in current day, you know, in former, before Mexico City, but we did have larger villages that were connected to each other. So some of the work being done, I'll just jump ahead here to this one, being done by Heckenberger and others are demonstrating these Kikuru settlements. And the Kikuru are some of the few Amerindians today where there's a direct cultural history back to before the Portuguese arrived. And he's done work here and talks about deep cultural landscapes where the settlements were profoundly shaped and connected to each other, galactic settlements with road networks across the region. And these roads are not really visible except when we start looking at things from a remote sensing, where we're starting to see patterns of vegetation in certain ways. So that's really helped see some of this. Just go back at forest mosaics, very important point, where these large sedentary agriculturalists had developed what was really a forest mosaic, where there were forests that had utility, semi-wild forests, they had fields that they were using, and some that were in fallow. There was a mosaic of, and a continuum really of land use around these large villages, but that people were staying in place in these villages and not really moving. And that's why we end up with those dark earths, because of their longer term inhabitation. So the dark earths are really key to this, but it really adds to a lot of ethnobotanical and archaeological work that has taken place at the same time and continues today. In fact, we're only really seeing a new opening of the Amazon region because for a long time the Amazon was a place where not much archaeological work was done. And the reason for this was twofold. Well, one was that archaeological research in tropical areas is very challenging because the preservation of materials is very difficult. So there were some challenges that way. Another one was that there was really a hold on the funding of archaeological work in the region. How many of you have heard of the theory of environmental determinism? Nobody has heard of environmental determinism? Yes. Geography students? So the theory of environmental determinism, which is actually, go back to that map of the blank Amazon. Environmental determinism was a theory that existed in the early 1900s that said that people's ability to become a civilization was tied to their physical environment. And so this was, as you can imagine, a theory of proponents were in what we call today the global north, saying it had racist implications and all sorts of things like that, saying people in lowland areas, because it was hot, wouldn't rise to a level of civilization that people in temperate areas had or people in mountainous areas had. That's the simple version of it, but essentially it's saying that the environment determines people's capacity to develop as a civilization, as a culture. And Betty Meggers was somebody who was a proponent of this theory. She was an archaeologist who worked in the Amazon, and although she found pottery and other credible structures on Marajo Island, that island in the mouth of the Amazon, she claimed that that was only there because that level of culture and civilization had migrated down from the Andes, where there was high civilization. She worked at the Smithsonian. In fact, I think she is somewhere near 100 years old now. She's still alive. And the Smithsonian at that time, during much of the middle of the 1900s, was the prime source of funding for archaeological work done by North Americans in a place like Amazonia. At the time, Brazil really didn't have a research infrastructure to be doing much of that themselves. And any time a proposal came in that would challenge her ideas of civilizations and cultures in Amazonia, she would not fund that proposal. So for a long time, that limited certainly North Americans from going in. Since that time, she's partially retired, but at least no longer keeping the hands on the purse strings. There are many other sources of funding, and the Brazilians are doing much more of the work, of the archaeological work. Europeans have come in. So there's a great deal of new evidence that is coming at the same time that new techniques in archaeological research have emerged that work in a place like the Amazon is possible. So all of these things together, adding on to that, the fact that as we think of postmodern and post-structural approaches, we are much more interested in nuance and understanding and acknowledging that there might not be a wholesale one theory works everywhere. We're much more open to human differences. And so all of those things together have really contributed to this new vision of, or this revision really of prehistory in the Amazon. But it's an evolving process. And there's still a lot of lingering maps and misinformation out there. This one's in here because I have, it's an example of more recent archaeological work near the city of Santarém, which is a city halfway between Manaus and Belém, which are the two largest cities in the Brazilian Amazon. And it's right on the bluffs. You can see the photograph there at the top of the slide is a bluff overlooking, it's right where the red arrow is on the map. And you look over the Amazon and the tributary coming in there, which is the Tapajós. Santarém is there today. It's a city today. It was a city, was founded by the Portuguese, but it was an Indian settlement before that. It's a prime piece of real estate because it's on bluffs overlooking a confluence of two major rivers. And right around there, including on the other side here on this bluff, is a place called Taperinha, and then also over on this side of the Amazon River is a place of the cave of the painted stone, and that, let me go back, is work done by Anna Roosevelt, who is one of the archaeologists who's come in and really challenged Meggers and her notions of Amazonian civilizations not being able to rise much. Anna was really one who opened it up, and that's now been followed by Heckenberger and others. But in both those locations, along these bluffs, there's major deposits of darker soil where people were living. So all that together is allowing us to see things in a different light. So new views of Amazonia. Well, one of the best places to read about some of these revisionist views, certainly in the academic literature you can, there's a great book called 1491 by a guy named Charles Mann, who's a science writer. And he wrote this book called 1491. And you can see here on the map on your right, you can see he's filled in some of those things in that what was a blank map in Amazonia. Because he's really consolidated a lot of research done by geographers, by botanists, and by archaeologists and anthropologists, bringing together this new story of Amazonia. So what do we do with all this new information? Because now we want to think about the future. Right? The Amazon is the lungs of the world, at least according to some. We are interested in its biodiversity. There is biodiversity, there incredible biodiversity of animals and plants. But what we're learning is that some of that diversity has an anthropogenic or people imprint. So we have to get over our idea that biodiversity, high biodiversity, is a place that doesn't have a human imprint or a human hand in creating that biodiversity. And this is a difficult step, especially for North Americans to make, because we've all grown up with this idea that there is this thing called wilderness out there that is separate from people. We have this divide between people and nature, or at least traditionally we have. This is being challenged and it is changing a little bit, but there's still this idea out there that there is wild nature and then there's people, and that those two don't mix. So in order to effectively conserve the Amazon, we have to accept that there is a cultural dimension to that, and that the forests are biocultural. And it doesn't mean it's less natural, and it certainly doesn't mean it's not worth preserving or conserving, but it just means we have to shift our framework and our vision of what the region is. And certainly the services of the forest, as long as of the world and as many other services of that forest, whether it has more humanized species or less, doesn't really make a difference in that service function, so it's certainly worth conserving. We've also learned that the indigenous areas in the Amazon are some of the places that are most effective at protecting the forest. So Dan Nefsted, an ecologist at Woods Hole, has documented quite clearly that the indigenous lands serve as some of the greatest buffers against the development, the industrial development that is happening in the region. So this is a map put together of conservation areas in the Amazon. And a lot of the efforts by the Brazilians in conservation are much more accepting of this human element. So that most of these kinds of units of conservation that exist have permit the living of people in it, and in fact the active involvement of people, and especially these indigenous reserves. You can see the gray areas are the indigenous reserves, which are some of the largest tracts of land there are. So in this sense, the Brazilians are probably a bit more progressive in their thinking. They're having to be realistic because they have to negotiate with people that actually occupy these spaces, and they cannot just set aside parks the way we were able to here in North America a number of years ago. So the future of the Amazon brings me back, believe it or not, to Betty Meggers, who wrote about a decade ago. She was reading some of the stuff by Roosevelt and Heckenberger and others, and she really became concerned not just that people, that they were wrong, but she raises a really important issue that I think is thought-provoking. I've called it Betty's panic. And she says uncritical acceptance of the conclusions of the revisionist assessments not only conflicts with ecological and archaeological evidence, her theories, but provides support for the unconstrained deforestation of the region. So what she's worried about is that if we stop talking about the Amazon as this wilderness, this place of very few people, or untouched by people, that means it'll be wholesale destruction. And although I think she's at an extreme, I think there is some pause here that we do need to give to her thought, and it's been reiterated in other publications. Because we do, at this point, have some real challenges to the forest, be it a wild forest or a biocultural one, because we do have development, which many people see as a positive thing in the region, but aspects of it are quite destructive. The industrial agriculture that is happening, especially with soybeans, is opening up enormous areas that are going to have a very difficult time ever regrowing. So the scale of these activities typically completely ignore ADEs, because some of these soy fields are as big as Rhode Island and other states. So there is this challenge, and so I'm very sensitive to the discourse about talking about Amazonia as an anthropogenic place, and a place of human impacts, of past human imprints, and being concerned that that's taken the wrong way. So we need to think more creatively about that, and we know that the agricultural development at that industrial scale will likely continue in the southern parts of the region, but will hopefully be stemmed by things like the indigenous reserves and other attempts by the Brazilians to control access to land that is in some way a conservation region at this point. So some are arguing we need to think for the rest of the Amazon, think of some historical and applied historical ecology, again, bringing people for smallholder agriculturalists, who are still the dominant farmers in the region, that sort of thinking back at how these forest mosaics and fields and fallow systems were practiced in the past may have some future application in terms of sustainable development, allowing people to both improve their livelihoods as well as conserving, again, the function of the forest. Another idea that has come really quite directly out of Amazonian dark earths is something called biochar. And this is of interest to any of you. I suggest you type into your favorite search engine the International Biochar Initiative, which is a direct outcome of some of the early research on dark earths. And what biochar is essentially that burnt earth that I was talking about earlier, where you take residue from agriculture, lumber mills, slaughterhouses. It's being done in all sorts of ways in the US, in Brazil, in Australia, and many other countries. And that organic waste essentially is being subjected to slow, cool burning to create this kind of aromatic carbon that the Indians probably created in the past through burnt earth systems of slash and char. And this biochar then is being applied as a soil conditioner, and this has been around now for long enough that we're starting to see some initial field trials and showing that the application of biochar to agricultural systems throughout certainly the tropics, but elsewhere, even in the southeast United States, is really improving the soil over the long term. And what's nice is that this is an organic fertilizer, and so the long-term improvements will stay, whereas we know from chemical fertilizers that after a while you have to keep adding more and more fertilizer because the effects of it aren't working so well. The other nice side benefit of biochar is that it can sequester carbon, so there's a positive element there as well. So let me end there and leave you with this quote from a famous cultural geographer: "Life must be lived amidst that which was made before." In this case, these soils and cultural forests of the Amazon, in which people need to continue to live and generate livelihoods today. So that we need to open ourselves up to conserving biocultural forests, being comfortable with that, and then continue efforts to support development that is inclusive and works with the environment, including dark earths and biochar and other things like that. So, thank you, and I will open it up for questions, comments, and thoughts.